am always torn about whether I should or have the right to identify myself as Indigenous. It's something that I feel like I straddle two different cultures, and the two places where I inhabit tell me different things about how I should consider myself. So as a person from the US, I feel like, yes, unequivocally, I consider myself Indigenous. I feel like my grandmother was Wirarica. My grandfather also had Coca descent on my mother's side. I'm mixed race and my dad is white. But because my grandmother was Native American, she suffered a great deal of discrimination, which directly caused her to leave Mexico and come to the United States as an undocumented immigrant with my mother and start a new life in the United States. I feel like the experience that they had, racism and discrimination, led directly to me. That part of what they experienced is something that went towards molding me and who I am. My grandmother was taken away from her mother as a child. The Wira language and Wira culture is something that was lost in the generation of my grandmother. So my mother never learned it, and naturally enough, neither did I. I feel like a detribalized person. However, I don't live in the US, I live in Mexico, and the relationship to indigeneity in Mexico is quite different. I think that if you're in the United States, we are, as Latinos, are already part of a minority. The US way of thinking about race has to do with like blood quantum, but from the Mexican context, 90% of Mexicans would be indigenous by that way of understanding. But only a minority of Mexicans were raised in an indigenous context, speaking an indigenous language and practicing an indigenous culture, and also suffering racism and prejudice because of their indigeneity. So in Mexico, if 90% of Mexicans were to suddenly declare that they were all indigenous, that would instantly marginalize the population of Mexicans who continue to practice indigenous ways of living, who suffer from prejudice because of their indigenous identity. Skin color in Mexico doesn't really have anything to do with it. You can be a mestizo and be fully indigenous, but if your community has given up that indigenous way of life and they no longer really identify as indigenous, they have basically become absorbed into mainstream Mexican culture. I live in Mexico, I don't live in the US, so that means that from the Mexican context, I don't think I do have the right to claim that I am indigenous. Like, I'm mixed race, and so I feel like I spent my entire life already in this in-between position, like not knowing if I am white or if I am Mexican or if I'm Native American. And in fact, I know exactly what I am, and that's that I am Mexican. I am white passing, but like people don't treat me that way. This position of being Native American and these two extremely divergent ways of understanding it is something that I live in between. I tend to describe myself as of indigenous descent. My artwork is all wrapped up with an embrace of indigenous identity. I am very concerned with indigenous spirituality. I feel that as a Chicano and as a Mexican and Mexican American and as a person of indigenous descent, that we live in a culture that is capitalist, that has values that I think are fundamentally at odds with the well-being of the planet. And indigenous spirituality has at its core an ethos of reciprocity with the natural environment. That alone is a reason why Latinos should embrace an indigenous spirituality, because we're living in a moment of global warming and of extreme imbalance with the natural world, and thinking of the planet, of the earth, as a being who has agency and will and who suffers at our hands as opposed to a thing which is there to be exploited is, I think, extremely important. And I think that there's a way to thread this needle and be able to claim both of these identities at the same time. On top of that, I'm queer. That has also left me in a rather embattled position within my own community. It's important for me to make artwork that reflects queer identities. We are the descendants of a colonized culture who were taught to be extremely Catholic, and as part of that, taught to be homophobic. Indigenous cultures cannot be said to be any way. It can't be said that indigenous cultures are some kind of like a freewheeling, queer-loving paradise, or that they were homophobic, because it's like there's hundreds of cultures, and like some cultures were the one way, some cultures were another way. It's like some were surely more accepting, some were more liberal, some were not. It's like there's a wide variety of ways of being. And it's also hard to know what any particular group was like, because what they were before the coming of the Spanish was not to anyone's advantage to describe. Most of the texts that we know about were written after the conquest. The people who were writing them may have already become homophobic as a result of the conquest. And if they weren't, they certainly didn't have any compelling reasons to say, oh, our ancestors were super open and we had like 3 or 4 genders or 5 or 6 or 7, or like that wasn't something that was going to happen. And consequently, we really can't know. On the one hand, it shouldn't matter. What is right is right. Embracing queer people as part of our community is really the only right thing to do. And whatever our ancestors thought is sort of irrelevant because what's right is right. Beyond that, there is certainly the possibility of interpreting our ancestors' culture through a lens that makes space for queer identities. People often tell me is that, oh, our ancestors like had the death penalty for gay sex and things like that. And there are texts that explicitly say that. And so there's an argument to be made that that is true. However, there are also texts that describe many texts written by many people across many cultures that describe the existence of men who dressed like women, who lived in the court of kings and who were priestesses, and these supposed men who dress like women sound an awful lot like trans women to me. In fact, what they sound like are mushes or third genders or fourth genders, or like a diversity of an understanding of what gender means. Another thing that people often tell me is that by embracing the idea of a diversity of genders, I'm embracing some kind of like a European construct, and I'm colonized, and I'm imposing that on our people through my artwork. And I think it's the exact opposite. The existence of a variety of genders across Mesoamerica is a well-attested fact. It may or may not have been the case among the Mexica. I happen to believe it was. That it existed in Mesoamerica is beyond dispute. It continues to exist in Mesoamerica, and there are tribes who continue to have third and fourth genders. As a person of indigenous descent, as a person who seeks to decolonize myself and to live a life that embraces indigenous spirituality and ways of being, embracing the idea of other genders, embracing the idea of sexual diversity is not something that comes to me from the European mindset or from a European way of viewing the world, but rather something that comes to me from an indigenous mindset, an indigenous way of viewing the world. Our vision is open, that our vision is embracing of a variety of ways of being in this world.